Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. So, continuing along our reading of Al-Fawz al-Kabir in order to ascertain the usul al-Tafsir, principles of Tafsir, from the mind of Shah Waliullah rahimahullah, and from others as well. We're going to try to bring in some other ideas and thoughts by the end of the seminar. So as we outline in this particular slide, there are 5 Quranic themes. So I switched from calling them Quranic sciences to what's a better translation is the 5 Quranic themes you find. Every single verse is divided into basically 3, and one of them is 3 types. So you have Ilm al-Jadal, polemics, and the Quran deals with 4 major groups. Then you have the science of Tadhkir, reminders, or the theme of reminder, and that deals with the past, the present, and the future. And then you have Ilm al-Ahkam, the laws pertaining to our human conduct and behavior. So we covered Ilm al-Jadal in the last few weeks in quite some detail, and chapter 2 of the book is dealing with the rest of the 4. So Ilm al-Jadal was covered, and now we're dealing with the rest of the 4. Last week we began that chapter by looking at the reminders of the present, reminders of God's blessings. We looked at the attributes of Allah. We looked at reminders of Allah's favor, Allah's favors, and Allah's signs in the universe. Then we began reminders about the past, which is history, which he calls Tadhkir bi Ayyamillah. Where did we leave off? I think we left off on this page. Okay. So on this page, I believe I mentioned that we're going to begin by talking about Al-Qasas al-Mutakarrara fil Quran. The Al-Qasas al-Mutakarrara fil Quran. The repeated stories in the Quran. So we are talking about the reminders of the past, Ayyamillah, the great events, past nations. And he has a section where he discusses about the idea of the stories in the Quran that are repeated. And I'm just trying to find my page. And what he says there, Bismillah, وَمِمَّا تَكَرَّرَ فِي الْقَصَصِ فِي الْقُرْآنِ الْعَظِيمِ. So he says the following from the stories that are often repeated in the Quran are the following. He said, قصة خلق بني آدم or خلق آدم من الطين وسجود الملائكة له واستكبار الشيطان عنه وكونه ملعونا وسعيه بعد ذلك في إضلال بني آدم. So the story of Adam being created from clay, the angels bowing down to them, and Shaitan's rejection and his arrogance, and his being cursed, and his struggle to delude human beings. So this comes in many, many places. So you find, the angels being commanded to prostrate to Adam, I believe, in 2 places. And the story of Adam in various capacities in many, many places. And then you have قصص محاجة نوح وهود وصالح وإبراهيم ولوط وشعيب مع شعوبهم. The stories of the arguments of Nuh, Hud, Saleh, Ibrahim, Lut, and Shu'aib throughout the Quran with their peoples. I'm not going to read the details. He just lists all the different stories. It's not an exhaustive list, but he's giving you an example. Qisas Mihnat Ayub wa Yunus, the trial of Ayub and Yunus alayhim salam. Qisat Dua Zakaria wa Istihbab wa Istijabatullahi ta'ala iyahu, the dua of Zakaria and Allah's answer to that dua. Qisat wa Qasas Sayyidina Isa al-Ajiba min waladatihi min ghayri ab, the whole story of Isa alayhi salam and all the miracles associated with him. And he says, let me skip to the end. Let me forward the slide for those who are reading. In the end of that section, he says, فذكرت هذه القصص في القرآن العظيم بأساليب وذكرت هذه القصص في القرآن العظيم بأساليب متنوعة من الإيجاز والإطناب حسب مقتضى الأساليب المرعية في السور. He says these stories come in varying details. So, من الإيجاز والإطناب, which means either they're brief or they're expanded. So the length of the stories in its various dimensions. Sometimes the stories come in an expanded form. Sometimes they come in a more brief form. Sometimes they're just alluded to, depending on what Allah is trying to convey. بحسب مقتضى الأساليب المرعية في السور. Depending on the surahs, the chapters, what they're trying to achieve and accomplish. So that's all he mentions here. He doesn't go into a lot of detail, but this is an important question for you all to think about. You know, when I mentioned that, if you keep in mind that the Quran is meaningful, it's not random, and everything in the Quran is there for a purpose. There's nothing that is redundant. So when you keep that idea in mind, then when you see a story repeated more than once, there's a reason for that, and you need to ask yourself, okay, why is this coming more than once? So when you're reading the Quran or you're researching themes, if you find a verse or a story mentioned 8 times versus a story mentioned 1 time, there is some meaning to that. So you need to think about that. And also when you have the same story, exact same story, not the same person, but the same story, same incident being related again and again, then there's a significance to that. And then when you have the same story and you compare the 2 stories and their varying details, then there's also meaning to that. Allah is trying to bring to forefront various dimensions of that story. So all of that is meaningful. So you need to ask these questions. As I keep saying in the class in Sahih al-Bukhari, this great book, Sahih al-Bukhari, is for thinkers, and people can only benefit from that who are thinkers. They think about it. They ask questions. If that's so for a human book, imagine the book of Allah Azza wa Jal, even more so. So the more you reflect, that's why you have tadabbur of the Quran is important Islamic teaching. Tadabbur is not just understanding the Quran, but it's thinking about it, digging into it, reflecting over it, asking questions. Why is this here the way it is? Why are these words the way they are? Why did Allah put this order of this sentence here? So there must be a reason to that. And the more you think and reflect over that, the more insights come to you. And it could be that the insights come to you are unique, and you might not have read that before. And that's what the Tadabbur al-Quran does. It's absolutely the case. There's no tafsir in the world where the Mufassir has uncovered all the insights and put them before you, so that now you can, be lazy and say, you know what, I'll just read the tafsir. I don't have to think about it. No, the times change. When times change and you have different circumstances, when you read the Quran, it's always fresh. It's always anew. And the Quran is reading you back, and Allah is revealing insights to you. So that's important to keep in mind. He doesn't go into details here, but this needs to be put in the back of your mind. Why are stories repeated? And other scholars have delved into that, and you can read what they have wrote about that particular point. And then he says, ما ذكرت من القصص مرة أو مرتين. He says, what is mentioned in the stories once or twice. Okay. Or some stories that are mentioned once or twice. So then he lists here, وَأَمَّا الْقِصَص الَّتِي لَمْ تَتَكَرَّرْ فِي الْقُرْآنِ بَلْ وَرَدَتْ فِي مَوْضِعٍ أَوْ مَوْضِعَيْنِ فَهِيَ. He just gives you a list. There are some stories that come only once in the Quran or twice. So he makes a separate list. And he says, قِصَّةُ رَفْعِ سَيِّدْنَا إِدْرِيسَ مَكَانًا عَلِيًّا. Idris, the Prophet Idris mentioned once. قِصَّةُ مُحَاجَ سَيِّدْنَا إِبْرَاهِيمَ لِنَمْرُودَ. Ibrahim arguing with the king Namrud, the tyrant. Qissat Wiladat Sayyidina Musa, the birth of Musa alayhi salam, appears once. وَإِلْقَاؤُهُ فِي الْيَمِ, his being cast into the sea. So he mentions a number of stories, Qissat Bilqis, Qissat Dhul Qarnayn, and so on and so forth. So there are various stories that are mentioned briefly, or not briefly, but only once or twice. And he says at the end, let's just skip to the end, he says, okay, فَلَيْسَ الْغَرَض, and that's, the section heading is in the wrong place. It should be beyond this paragraph. So in the paragraph he says فليس الغرض من سرد هذه القصص في القرآن الكريم معرفتها بأنفسها بل الغرض الأساسي. He says the real reason for sharing these stories is not to teach you the stories. That's not the purpose of relating these stories in the Quran, to teach you history. It's not a history book. It's not here to teach you what Musa went through, or what Isa went through, or the history of these great Anbiya. But Bal al-Gharad al-Asasi, the great reason for these stories, هو ينتقل ذهن القارئ والسامع إلى شناعة الشرك والمعاصي, to make you realize in your mind and visualize the evil of shirk and disobedience, the evil of disobedience to Allah, and the evil of associating partners with Allah. وَمُعَاقَبَةِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى عَلَيْهَا, and the great punishment of Allah for these types of people. وَاطْمِئْنَانَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ بِنُصْرَةِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى وَتَأْيِيدِهِ, and to give the comfort to the hearts of the believers and the glad tidings of the help of Allah and the victory that comes from Allah. وظهور ألطافه وأفضاله تعالى في حق عباده المخلصين, and his dealing in a gentle, merciful way with his servants, his believers. So all of these are themes in the Quran. The Quran teaches you that Allah is with you. Allah's victory is at hand. وَالْعَاقِبَةُ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. So وَالْعَاقِبَةُ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ is a great passage or great expression in the Quran that tells you the future is for the muttaqeen. So in every trying times, troubling times, times of difficulty, if you keep this brief sentence in mind, وَالْعَاقِبَةُ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ, the future is always for the people of taqwa, the people who fear Allah, for the pious, for the believers. No matter how difficult it is for believers, they should rest assured that the future belongs to them. So this expression, for instance, the reason I share this expression is when you look it up, it appears in one passage, it appears more than once in the Quran. But the passage that it recalls to my mind is in chapter 28, which is called, irony of ironies. What's the chapter 28? Al-Qasas, stories. And that's a chapter where the whole surah is about the story of Musa, then the story of Qarun towards the end. So it's a whole story, a whole chapter, surah, that's called Al-Qasas. At the end of the story, towards the end of the surah, at the end of the story of Qarun, so first the story of Musa, and it's a great, great way of relating the story. The end of the passage ends by saying, وَالْعَاقِبَةُ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. It shows you that these stories, Allah interchanges these lessons in the stories. He starts the stories with the lessons, and while telling the story, He'll give you the lesson. At the end of the stories, He imparts those lessons. So that's the real reason for the sharing of these stories, not to give you history, because the Quran is not a history book. The fact that it's not a history book, it doesn't have to give you timelines, doesn't have to stick to chronology. People object, okay, why do we jump to this story here? It's not a history book. Had it been a history book, that objection might have been valid. Okay, why aren't we given a complete history? How many people were in the Battle of Badr? Why aren't we given details? That's not the purpose of this book. The purpose of this book is guidance, and specifically to reinforce your imagination, to help you visualize in a real way the help of Allah. Imagine you take the stories out, qasas out of the Quran, and you just talk about the lessons. Allah's help is near. Allah inna nasrallahi qareeb. The future is for the pious. Allah helps. Allahu ma'al muttaqeen. Allah is with the muttaqeen. If you just left those there without the stories, then it just reaches this level of yaqeen and certainty and affecting your heart. But when you share these stories like a great movie or a great image, I mean, that's a bad metaphor, but it still fits for us. You know, you can read about an incident, a historical incident, but when you watch a great movie about that incident, it reinforces in your mind who these people are because you have an image, you have, you know, you can kind of visualize it. Although you know the story exists, you know that this happened, but when you watch a movie, it's much more like it becomes deeper in your heart and mind. So that's what relating these stories is, al-qasas. To Allah is visualizing for you or showing you in a practical, concrete way His lessons, that the evil of shirk, the evil of disobedience, and how Allah favors the believers over the disbelievers, no matter how it may not seem or it may seem otherwise. Wallahu ta'ala alam. So that's the third Quranic theme, reminders of so we looked at reminders of the present, which is the blessings and favors of Allah last week. Today we just finished reminders of the past, history, al-qasas, and the next is reminders beyond death. Any questions? Yes. No, if you don't mind, so online students can hear you. And then you can turn it off.
So yeah, just a thought, bouncing off the thought you were mentioning. We were in a study circle a few years ago, and we were doing tafsir of, I think it was Surah Rahman, and we were thinking, or one of the conversations became about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was choosing particular, actually we were talking about tafsir in general at first, and we said Surah Baqarah is many stories, but it's not chronological. It's not, this happens and then this happens and then that happens. It bounces around, as you were mentioning. And one of the points we took from it was similar, that, a lot of the scholars, they say that we want knowledge that benefits us, beneficial knowledge. And so when we look at other faiths, sometimes they're arguing about very particular details about what this person looked like, or how old he was when such and such happened, or this detail or that detail. So one of the reflections we had at the time, and I think it was reinforced here, or strengthened here, is that if those details were as important as we're making them out to be, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have said it, or mentioned it explicitly. And the points that are being mentioned and what's not being mentioned is equally important, of where our minds should be going and directed towards, which is important because most, books that maybe in history class and others that I've read or had studied in school and whatever, are very much the opposite. They'll tell me everything about the World War or whatever from one point of view, by the way, but World War, but all these dates and details, and that's what the exams are about too, and all that, but not as much about what happened out of it, what was the point of even doing it, because we had to do another one right after, and we still are dealing with these type of issues. So that was just a thought.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's how Sira is written too. Like that's how human history is written, right? And Sira has been written like that too. So, like the Sira books have such incredible detail about the battles, and sometimes they seem meaningless. Like, does it really matter how many numbers were there? Just a general. In some battles, yes, because the numbers, the proportions were so different. But like details and who was present and lists of like descriptions and then some of them are contradictory. So that's the Maghazi tradition and the Sira tradition. Unfortunately, that's how it developed, and it had to develop that way. Maybe it could be argued that it had to be that way. But then that's why in our Sira class, just linking this with the Sira class, um, our Imam Rauf, Hafidhullah, he chose a book that's written with reflections in mind. It's a reflective, uh, presentation of the Sira by Mustafa Sibari. And if you compare the new Sira books, like contemporary books, with the old books, they're very different. Contemporary books, whether it's Ali Salabi's or Rahiq al Makhtoum, is kind of on the pattern of the old one, but still kind of also for a modern audience. So these Sira books, or Muhammad Ghazali's Fiqh al-Sira, Mustafa Sibai's, Tariq Ramadan's In the Footsteps of the Prophet, they're all trying to give you lessons. But the other problem here is that like lessons are subjective sometimes, right? Everyone will look at a story and come up with different reflections. So in the end, when you're learning something, do you want to just get the scholar's insights and reflections and just learn that? Or do you want the facts and then come up with your reflections? A good teacher is supposed to give you the facts, and then help you understand those facts and help you think about those facts. Not just give you, these are the 5 lessons of the Battle of Badr. Then you memorize the 5 lessons. That's not real teaching because you're not going to remember those. Yeah, but if it teaches you, reimagines for you what happened in the Battle of Badr, and then helping you think. So that's a challenge of reflecting on history and writing about Sirah. How do you do that? You know, like, do you just give subjective lessons and less facts, or you focus more on facts, or the basic facts at least, or not in the eliminating the non-essential facts, or what approach do you follow? You know, so the good thing about Quran is Quranic approach is always the best. Quran is the best grounding. You know, like when you have stories that are mentioned in the Quran, then you don't have to worry. Like the story of Musa, there's no need to go anywhere else to look up the story of Musa in the Quran or the story of this prophet or that prophet. But when it comes to things like other battles that were like beyond the Anbiya, we don't really know a whole lot about, or they're found in other sources, then you're kind of looking at trying to piece together and to come up with an approach that works for you. Wallahu a'lam. So anyway, this is the Quran. This is a book of guidance. Any other questions online? Okay. So moving along. So Bayan at-Tadhkir bil-Mawti wa ma ba'dahu. That's the next section. So reminders of death and what lies beyond. So the Quran is not just history and present, but also it has to talk about the future because it's guidance for human beings. And we know the future is a huge portion of our deen, the akhirah, the next life. Without that, those are the essentials. What are the 3 basic core essentials of any deen? The 3 core themes of the Quran, if you break it down that way, is Tawheed, Risala, and Akhirah, right? Tawheed, Risala, and Akhirah. Allah's oneness, the prophets and messengers, and guidance and revelation. That's the second. And then the third is belief in the next life. These 3 essentials are so important because when you de-emphasize any of them, then your religion or your vision and your tradition becomes lopsided. So obviously the most important is Tawheed. When you de-emphasize Tawheed, then your religion becomes like mythology and like Harry Potter or like Lord of the Rings or something. There's people with powers and all sorts of crazy stories, and it's not about Allah, one creator, one sustainer, one being that's in charge, that's all powerful. When you put Tawheed there, then there's no power in any of these human beings. There's no objects. When you take away Tawheed, then there's more investment or more imagination of the power of objects. And that's what all this mythology is, like Captain America's shield and Thor's hammer, and all these come from Greek mythology. Those were religions. That's what shirk was, right? So there's a heavy emphasis in objects and the power of objects and the power of creation and this spell and that spell and things like that. When you have the Tawheedic vision, then all that goes away. Then it doesn't really matter. Even if there's something that has a little bit of power, even like something like the jinn, the Tawheedic vision gives you the idea and the impression that the jinn are silly. They're beings that you're supposed to laugh at because they're so powerless. They have a little bit of power, a little bit of influence over you, but it's so fleeting that all you need is to recite Ayatul Kursi, believe in Allah, and they can't do a thing to you. So it's not something to be feared. But when your iman in Allah is weak, then the fear of the jinns and supernatural forces becomes so powerful and strong, becomes overwhelming. So that's Tawheed. And the second idea is Risala. Risala and revelation. When you don't have that, when you de-emphasize the human beings that are messengers and the books of Allah, then you go into different directions with Tawheed, with Allah's belief. Then you can come up with all sorts of silly ideas. And then you have people today that deny the prophets and they don't believe in the prophets, and they just, religion is whatever they think the revelation means, or even the revelation is not that important for them. So, and then the third one, which is what we're talking about now, is the next life, akhirah. And we mentioned this again and again. When you de-emphasize akhirah, and that's what many faith traditions have done today, even perhaps many Muslims, when you de-emphasize the akhirah, then, you know, then your life becomes very different. Your way of looking at the world becomes very different. Tragedies become much more painful. Your, your ability to navigate around difficulties is very, very different. So any of these three elements, when they're taken away, there's no deen, there's no religion, there's no belief. Even if a Muslim denies or de-emphasize any of these beliefs, then you're not a Muslim. These are the essentials. There's no way you're a believer. Not just a Muslim, any faith tradition. If you're a follower of Jewish faith and you don't believe in the afterlife, then you're a disbeliever. I mean, you don't have any iman. Like, it's all or none. These three are essentials. And there are many Muslims that de-emphasize the akhirah too, and to the point of where they hardly believe in it. I don't just mean de-emphasize, they don't like talking about it, but we're talking about de-emphasis. So I remember, I don't like mentioning names, but I'm going to mention a name. So Mike Tyson's in the news today. So he donated like $10 million to Israel, and he's started this marijuana company that's run by Israelis, based in Israel. So I remember an interview he gave when his daughter died, and they asked him, "What do you think about your daughter? Is she in heaven?" He goes, "Well, I don't really know if there's an afterlife." So if those words come out of someone's mouth, that person's not Muslim, even if he's wearing a kufi, even if he's going for Umrah, even if he says Assalamu alaikum. Those are non-compromisables for us. Someone says there's no afterlife. There are many sects that don't believe in the afterlife. The whole nation of Islam, for instance, they do not believe in afterlife. They believe this idea of resurrection is a hoax. So any Muslim that claims to be Muslim, or any believer in any other faith tradition, if these three essentials are not there, it leads to a lopsided faith, and it's the complete absence of faith. So these are non-compromisable essentials. Okay, so reminders of death and what lies beyond. وقد ذكر جل شأنه من الموت وما بعده كيفية الإنسان عند موته وعجزه في تلك الساعة. So he says Allah has mentioned the affair of death and what lies beyond, and the helplessness of a human being at the time of death. وعرض الجنة والنار عليه بعد الموت, the presentation of the hellfire and paradise to the human being after his death. وظهور ملائكة العذاب أمامه, the appearance of the angels of the punishment before the disbeliever at the time of death. وأشراط الساعة من نزول سيدنا عيسى وخروج الدجال وخروج دابة الأرض. All the signs of the day of judgment, they're mentioned in the Quran. There are a lot of mention of some of the signs of the ending of the world, right? Like when the world is going to go through an end. وخروج يأجوج and مأجوج ونفخة الصعيق, the blowing of the trumpet, يأجوج and مأجوج, نفخة القيام وحشر والنشر, the resurrection of human beings, the gathering, والسؤال والجواب, the questioning and the answers, والميزان, the scale on the day of judgment, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to read the whole section, but you get the idea. So a bulk of the Quran is speaking again and again about these essential matters, about what lies beyond death, the ghaibiyat matters. Towards the end, what does he say? وَفَرَّقَ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى هَذِهِ الْمَطَالِبِ في مختلف الصور بالإجمال والتفصيل مراعية أساليبها الخاصة. So he says Allah relates these details just like the stories of the Quran in varying details throughout the Quran. So depending on what he intends to impart, the lessons he wants to give. So that's the end of that section. He doesn't go through a whole. So some of the sections of the book are amazing and he gets into a lot of detail. Some of them he leaves very brief. So that something that needs to be developed. The akhirah is a major theme of the Quran. 1/3 of the Quran is about the akhirah. And that's the purpose of all the messengers. Teach you about Allah, teach you about revelation, how to live, and teach you about akhirah. There's a lot that can be developed here. So think about that. And so we're leaving these open-ended questions for you to think about, to help you in your tadabbur of the Quran. Why is the akhirah there, and what does that do for us? And in many of the tafsir, in Tafhim al-Quran, for instance, the akhirah is huge. He talks about what the belief in the akhirah does for human beings. And our Shaykh Islahi, rahimahullah ta'ala, used to talk about that a lot. That was one of his themes, that the akhirah, what does it do for the reform of humanity? And what does it not do? So without a real solid belief in the akhirah, you can never really have reform in society. You can never have true justice. You can never have people acting justly. So that's essential. For us, that's an essential component of, living in this world in a just way, in a balanced way, in an equitable way, and to reform human beings. There's nothing that can do that. No laws can reform human beings. Laws are meant to be broken. It's not laws, it's not the enforcement of even Sharia as a law that's going to save the world. Yes, it is, but what I'm trying to say, it's not that the enforcement of those laws, but it's the building up of human beings that fear Allah and fear what's going to happen the next day. That's the only thing that can stop people from stealing, stop people from, like cheating each other and oppressing each other. The laws are not going to do that, because the laws, they stop them from taking certain steps, but people work their way around the laws. Like our former President Trump, he doesn't pay any taxes. And he said it's stupid to pay taxes. You have to know how to avoid those laws. Although the laws are in place, but people, and all the billionaires, like I remember when I gave the talk on Qarun, I had looked it up. I don't know if it's still the case. A couple of years ago, I looked up the richest man in the world was a founder of Amazon, and he paid less than $1 of taxes that year that I looked it up. So the rich, they don't pay taxes. We pay taxes because they know how to skirt the law, because they have the resources and they know how to do that. So laws are not what reform human beings. Laws still have a purpose. I'm not saying we don't need laws, but it's not the laws that make human beings just and equitable with each other. The laws are just there for a different purpose. It's really that moral reform and that belief in the akhirah, nothing else. That's what Shaykh Islah used to say. And that's so true. Without that, you can have what happens today. People believe they're good human beings. They believe in humanitarian law. They believe in democracy. But they can watch 5,000 children die and melted to shreds. They can say, yeah, that's worth it. They can say that with a straight face because their belief in the akhirah is not that strong. Had they believed that, whatever they're doing is being recorded, the same thing is going to be done to them, and the next day is coming in a moment of time, because no one lives forever, then they would not be doing what they did. So the akhirah is only saving grace for humanity, belief in the akhirah, and that needs to be a central part of our da'wah. That's the only thing that can save, that's one of the only things that can save human beings. Okay? So that's all he says about akhirah, and I expanded on that a little bit. And then the final part is the rulings. Any questions, reflections on that? Okay, so the final Quranic theme in the Quran is, and that's the final one we think is the biggest one, because like most of us, we're worried about haram and halal, And there's an obsession with fiqh. There always has been in our tradition. And we want to know the ruling on everything, the ruling on this thing or that thing, the ruling on protests, the ruling on boycotts, the ruling on this and that. So, and then we think the Quran is a fiqh book. So we read the Quran, we expect it to be filled with what's haram and what's halal. But it's not the case. So the verses about the ahkam are so few. And even Shah Waliullah, recognizing that, perhaps put this number 5 and not number 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. But it's number 5 of the Quranic themes. So what does he say? Let's read what he says and we'll reflect over it later. بيان علم الأحكام والقاعدة الكلية في مباحث الأحكام. The overriding fundamental principle in the discussion of the ahkam. أن سيدنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أن سيدنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قد بعث بالملة الإبراهيمية الحنيفية فلزم إبقاء شرائع تلك الملة. So ولا يحدث أي تغيير في أمهات مسائلها اللهم إلا تخصيصا لعمومها وعموماتها وزيادة للتوقيتات والتحديدات فيها. So he says the fundamental principles that you need to keep in mind is that our Prophet, the Messenger of Allah, was sent with the millah of Ibrahimic way. So this is very important, the millah of Ibrahim. So it was the millah, basically we translate as the Ibrahimic nation, but it's every religion needs a structure. Every faith needs a mold. It needs something that you walk through. So Allah chose from the time of Ibrahim to the end of the world, He chose every prophet that He sent, every religion that He sent, followed that pattern, that mold of Ibrahim alayhi salam, the millah of Ibrahim. And so every line of prophets was from the descendants of Ibrahim, but every great thing that Ibrahim believed in and the great portions of his life, he used the millah of Ibrahim. One moment. Hey Dave, sorry, I'm in a meeting. You can leave the stuff in the front if you don't mind. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for delivering. Okay. So where was I? The millah of Ibrahim. So Allah chose the millah of Ibrahim to be the model for us. So from the millah of Ibrahim, Allah chose the essentials and He didn't change anything. So that's why we have things like circumcision, we have the Kaaba, we have Hajj, we have sacrifice of animals. We have so many things. Almost everything in our tradition is Ibrahimic in Islam. So the influence of Ibrahim is immense in our faith and tradition. In fact, like, it's no exaggeration, some scholars have said that if you look in the Quran even, which prophet is at the forefront? It's Ibrahim. Even more than Musa, even more than our Prophet ﷺ from one angle, because his story is everywhere. His approach is everywhere. His tawheed is everywhere. Everything that he lived for, like, it's so profound and like it's so deep. The Quran is Ibrahimic. Our religion is Ibrahimic. The Sharia is Ibrahimic. Our way of life is Ibrahimic. Everything about us is Ibrahimic. Everything the Prophet taught, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, his whole life is Ibrahimic. His salah, his zakat, his rites of pilgrimage, everything is Ibrahimic. Even our kalima comes from Ibrahim alayhi salam. When he was in the desert and, like Allah, we mentioned in the previous section, the stories of the prophets are meant to help you visualize and to understand what all these teachings are. So the teaching of La ilaha illallah comes from that story of Ibrahim looking at the stars. And he said something amazing when at the end he said, or even at every point of that journey, he said something so great that came from his heart, his pure heart, that he said, La uhibbul afilin, when he saw the stars set. He said, my heart can never be attached to something that goes away, something that decreases. He recognized that uful, that decrease, that going away, that quality of naqs, the quality of going away is not something that could be associated with Allah, the source of all life. And that's something so amazing. He said, Inni wajjahtu wajhiya lilladhi fatara samawati wal ard. I will turn my face towards the originator of all of this that he was looking at in creation. And that really is La ilaha illallah. So the kalima of La ilaha illallah comes from that story. And that's another way of expressing La ilaha illallah, through a story in a practical way. So even our kalima, our shahada, it comes from Ibrahim alayhi salam. Everything we do comes from Ibrahim alayhi salam. So he's mentioning that point here. The ahkam, they are also linked to the way of Ibrahim alayhi salam. So you have to remember that. And he says Allah chose the Arabs at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he used them and their customs, which were Ibrahimic in origin, as we mentioned in the beginning of this book. The mushrikeen, they were Ibrahimic. They were an Ibrahimic nation. In some sense, you could say they were part of like an original nation, Ibrahimic nation, but they went astray and they wound up being mushrikeen. But everything is built around that. So he says towards the end, so you have to know the adat al-Arab wa rusumahum, you have to know their customs and you have to kind of know their traditions in order to understand some of the customs or some of the rulings in the laws of the Sharia. And he says, where does the sentence begin? فإن أمعنت النظر في مجموع شرائع الملة الحنيفية, if you examine all the laws of the Millah of Hanifiyah and you look at the customs and the of the Arabs and you look at their laws, الذي هو بمنزلة الإصلاح والتهذيب لها, which had come for reforming and refining their lives, علمت أن لكل حكم سببا وفهمت أن لكل أمر ونهي مصلحة وتفصيل ذلك يطول. In the end, he makes a point. He said, if you look at every single law, you realize, and you look at the way of Ibrahim and the Arabs, and if you realize this fundamental principle, أن لكل حكم سببا, that every hukam has a sabab. What does that mean? Every hukam has a sabab. Anyone? Okay. What's hukam? Ruling. Every ruling has a purpose, so sabab. So sabab, but then he says, the next thing he says, لِكُلِّ أَمْرٍ وَنَهْيٍ مَصْلَحَةً. Every command and prohibition has a maslaha. What's a maslaha? What sabab was maslaha? Cause, yeah. Cause is more precise. Like sabab nuzul is not really the purpose of the verse, but it's the cause of the verses. So like, for what reason, specific reason was this verse revealed? So sabab, like every hukam has a sabab, it has a reason, it has something that brings it into effect. It's not necessarily the wisdom behind it. So wisdom is slightly different. Sometimes it could be, but so every ruling has something behind it, some context, some, you can say purpose from one angle, but really some cause or some reason. Yeah, so in technical fiqh terminologies, the sabab of a ruling is like, so when we pray Salatul Arsha, what's the sabab for Salatul Arsha? What's the cause that brings it into effect? The timing, yeah. It's the dissipation of all light from the atmosphere, which is an hour and a half after Maghrib. So that's the sabab for the Arsha prayer that brings the ruling into effect. So it's not the purpose of prayer, it's the specific reason that brings it into effect. And the same thing with Fajr, is the rising of the sun, dawn. Maghrib, it's the setting of the sun. And then the sabab for wudu is the timing of prayer and you having lost your wudu. So things like that. So every hukum has a sabab, has something behind it that you need to dig into. And every amr and nahi, every like hukum that is pertaining to forbidding you from something, whether zina, alcohol, it's for a maslaha. Maslaha is benefit. Benefit is for a benefit. So he's still not talking about wisdom, but wisdom is another thing that can come out of it. So every command is for a benefit, has a benefit. That's very, very important. And that not everyone recognizes that. Some great scholars did, other scholars did not. Okay? So that's very, very important. That means, what are the implications of that in Shah Waliullah's thought? And there are some scholars that say the Sharia is there because Allah commanded you. It's a test, and you just have to do it. So that's one perspective. But then there's another perspective, great scholars held on to, that there's nothing that Allah told you to do except that it's for your benefit. It's for some benefit. So if He forbade you from something, surely there is a benefit in that, i.e. there's a harm in that thing that you would have done. So that would apply to gambling, alcohol, zina, all the prohibitions in the Quran. And then all the commands, they're not meaningless just to test you. I mean, there is something there that's a benefit for you. The benefit could be in the next, we don't know the benefit in every single case, but surely it is there. So there are great scholars that have tried to come up with the benefits, or from a different angle, what is the wisdom of the Sharia? So people have talked about that. What's the wisdom of this ruling? Well, you have to understand, some of these asbab we know in the Quran and in the Sunnah. Some of these masalih we do know. But sometimes we don't know them, and we can work them out. And when we work them out, it's the ijtihad of our scholars. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they can get it wrong. So he says, وَتَفْصِيلُ ذَلِكَ يَطُولُ. The discussion of that would take too long. So he doesn't go into it here. So he just mentions that. But he does go into it, and we need to mention that here in another great work. So he wrote another great work that probably is his magnum opus for Shah Waliullah. And it's a book that no one wrote before him and probably after him. It's a book that has no equivalent in our tradition. It's a book that has no genre that it's part of, because no one ever wrote that or thought about that before. Or, I mean, they've thought about it, but no one really thought about it in a systematic way and put it together in a systematic way. And that book is called Hujjatullah al-Baligha, the binding proof, conclusive proof of God. Hujjatullah al-Baligha. It's a massive book. So it's, 2 volumes. So it's a large book of 2 volumes. So that is a book of where Shah Waliullah constructs his vision of Sharia and the revelation, and puts all the pieces together to give you a representation, a cohesive, uniform representation of what the Sharia is. And he relates every command to something higher, and he puts it all together. He gives you fundamental principles and then the sub-principles, what every part of the Sharia falls under. Half of the book is very philosophical and brings in sociology and things like that. And half the book is particularly relating to the rules of Sharia, mostly hadith. He puts all the hadith in the chapter together. So, or under broader principles. So he was always asking the question, when you read this hadith or this verse of the Quran, this Quranic teaching, what does it fall under? What broader category? What's the purpose of this hadith? What's the purpose of this teaching? And he gave you a remarkable vision, for his vision of what that is. And he doesn't have to be right on everything, but it's a remarkable book. Since he authored it, it's been taught in Azhar University. It's part of the curriculum, and it's taught throughout the world, and it's something worth looking at and reading. So it's really brilliant. Like, he looks at things in a brilliant way. So that's where he's looking into the wisdom and the how everything relates to one another. Okay. 5 minutes. Let me go forward. He talks about دور التشريع الإسلامية في إصلاح الملة الحنيفية. So here he mentions وبالجملة فقد كانت تتطرق إلى العبادات من الطهارة والصلاة والصوم والزكاة والحج والذكر فتور عظيم من جهة التساهل في إقامتها واختلاف الناس فيها بسبب عدم معرفة أكثرها والتسرب بالتحريفات الجاهلية إليها، فأصلح القرآن العظيم ذلك الاختلال كله وسواها حتى استقام أمرها. So he says, now he's talking about like in the context of the various sharias. He's talking about why different prophets and why different laws and different sharias, putting it all together. He's saying what happens is laxity falls in, because he made a point that it was always the Ibrahimic way for the last few thousand years. Maybe before that was Nuh and something different. But always the Ibrahimic way that Allah pointed to, and the Sharia was basically the same with varying details, but the fundamentals were the same in all prophets and nations. So shirk was shirk and salah was salah, but the timings would have been different. He says, why is there he said, because of this laxity. He talks about the futurun, great laxity. People forget these teachings. They forget about the akhirah. The Jews forgot about the akhirah. The Christians forgot about the laws. I mean, there are reasons for that, why they forgot about it, because some of it was purposeful. But you forget about the laws, you forget about these things, and laxity spreads in, and most people just become oblivious to them, and hence the need for new revelation. So that's what he talks about. That's why Allah sent and revived the millah of Ibrahim through Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And then as for the laws pertaining, so this is the laws pertaining to the millah of Ibrahim. As for the laws pertaining to the mu'amalat of human transactions, the reason for that is all sorts of injustices fell in. All sorts of injustices, like people began to oppress human beings. They began to oppress each other. Human beings began to, in marriage and divorce and property and all these things, they began to encroach on each other. So the rise of injustice in society led to the need for Allah to reveal, do not kill one another, do not backbite one another, do not commit zina, but rather take people in holy matrimony or take these sacred covenants between husband and wife. So at the end he says, التعريضات التي تحتاج إلى البيان, he says, and I'll just summarize, I don't want to go into the section next week. He says some things that require a little bit of detail, and it's not that important of a section. He says there are some things that the Prophet would ask about and he responded to. So the ilmul ahkam, or the Quranic verses dealing with the rulings, some of them have to do with answering a specific question. So you have many verses, يسألونك عن أهلة, يسألونك عن الخمر والميسر, يسألونك عن المحيض, قل هو أذى. So these are answers. So Allah uses that style. He just takes questions that came to the Prophet and he gives the answer as a revelation. And then sometimes there's specific events that the believers were involved in. So Allah praised the believers and their approach, and that became a ruling. And then he threatened the hypocrites, and that became a ruling not to do this. And then sometimes events took place, such as vanquishing the enemy, repelling their mischief, and Allah reminded of their blessings. So he's just repeating here, that's what reminders of the blessings of Allah. And then at the end he says, sometimes you need to know about details, so Allah alludes to specific, very specific incidences. So the battle of Badr alluded to in Surah Al-Anfal. The battle of Uhud alluded to in Surah Ali Imran. Khandaq in Surah Al-Ahzab. Hudaybiyah in Surah Al-Fath. The campaign of Banu Nadir in Surah Al-Hashr. And then the opening of Makkah in Surah Al-Fath. And so many examples. Hajjatul Wida' in Surah Al-Ma'idah. Story of the marriage of Zainab in Surah Al-Ahzab. The slander against Aisha, Surah An-Nur. The mention of the delegation of the jinn in Surah Al-Jinn. The night journey, Surah Al-Isra. There's specific, very specific historical incidents that the Quran does refer to. And Allah gives you lessons, but then sometimes you need details from the other sources, namely the Sunnah of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So the last sections don't have to do with the ahkam, but then he kind of gives you details that he perhaps may have missed. And this is the final section on the screen. So this is with that we conclude the 5 Quranic themes. So all the content of the Quran, this is Shah Waliullah's division of that content and his discussion of what that content means and some points relating to that. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead. No. So in English, so Hujjatullah and Baligha was written in Arabic. So it's only available in Arabic. So there is an English translation of the first half, the philosophical half, which is less valuable than the second half. For us, at least, is less practical. It was translated by Marcia Emerson. Marcia Emerson is a alumni of the University of Chicago. She's a great professor. I met her in Chicago last year, actually. I've read her book years ago when I was in college, and it was a pleasure meeting her. She is Muslim. At some point along her journey, she became Muslim. So she's an interesting person. So she translated the first half, and I did talk to her because I wanted to translate the second half, and I did translate one chapter of that portion, and it's on my academia page, where Shah Waliullah talks about clothing in Salah. So then, anyway, she mentioned that she's completed the translation. This is like a year or two ago when I met her, and they're just like, it's kind of stuck somewhere. So it is going to be coming out at some point in the future, unless someone beats her to it. Marcia Emerson, or Hermerson. So if we had dinner with Sheikh Akram and her, and so she's American, she's Caucasian, so she busted out speaking Urdu. She speaks Urdu fluently. I was so shocked. So she spent a lot of her life. Her story was interesting. What I remember is she was interested in Hinduism or Buddhism, and she traveled. She wanted to travel to India, and back in those days in the 60s, and the journeys were perilous, and somehow she found up Afghanistan or Pakistan, I think Afghanistan, on her way to India. And then she didn't have a place to stay. She stayed with some Muslims, and then she just discovered Islam, and then she never made it all the way. Alhamdulillah. Okay, we can continue the discussion. I'm just going to stop the recording. So online students, 8:15 will resume Sahih Bukhari.